Hello and welcome to the 27th edition of the Positive Psychology Leader Series of the International Positive Psychology Association. We have next month, we'll have James Pawelski, our Executive Director. You're going to love James's presentation. It's defining the positive and positive psychology, something that is talked about quite often, and James, a philosopher, is going to be able to share some of his latest findings. And he's also a leader now in positive humanities. And so he's got some latest news in the humanities and how positive psychology is making its way into that field. So here we go. I'm going to introduce Dr. Diener now. And so Dr. Diener was a professor at the University of Illinois from 1974 until 2008, and now is a professor emeritus. You got to be a special guy to have emeritus after your title. He's also a senior scientist for the Gallup organization. Dr. Diener is now also a professor of psychology at both, get this, the University of Virginia and University of Utah. He was president of 3 scientific societies and the editor of Journal of Positive Psychology and Social Psychology. Dr. Diener was the founding editor of Perspectives on Psychological Science and a co-founder of Journal of Happiness Studies. He has, check this out, he has over 340 publications. Thank you so much for being here. Hello, Ed Diener.
Thank you, David. Well, it's an honor to be here, and it's fun. I wish my mom were on the line so she could have heard your introduction of me. It's a little over the top, but it's good to be here.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, we had, one of those things. We have to make sure that for the recording, people who are just tuning in via recording, they have to hear the background, and yours is a rich one. A couple questions for you. One, just when we're looking at all that you've accomplished in studying happiness, when you started researching happiness nearly 40 years ago, it wasn't so popular as it is now. So, if you could share with us, what was your catalyst or your inspiration to study happiness?
Well, when I first got into it as a student, and I told my professor I want to study happiness, and in particular, I said I wanted to study happiness of farm workers. I grew up on a farm, and farm workers, as you know, are not wealthy by any means. They tend to be poor, and yet a lot of them seem pretty happy. And I said, I want to measure the happiness of farm workers. And my professor said, Ed, you can't do that. Number one, there's no way to measure happiness. It's impossible. And secondly, I already know the answer. They're not happy. So I couldn't do that. I got dissuaded from the study, but when I got tenure at Illinois in 1980, I came back to it, and that's when I started studying happiness, and it always intrigued me. In that year, there was a scattering of studies mentioning subjective well-being, like a handful. Last year, there was over 10,000, something like 12 or 13,000 studies that at least said something about subjective well-being. So in those 40 years or 30 years, the field has really, really grown. It's just taken off. And positive psychology is part of the reason for that. If you look at the curve for subjective well-being in the literature, it's going up from 1980 to 1999. And from there, it just goes straight up. It's just amazing.
Well, I remember it wasn't that long ago, Ed, that you were referred in Time Magazine as Dr. Happy for all of your, do you remember that big Time Magazine article? Yeah. You still get stopped in the streets, there he is, Dr. Happy?
Well, I'll tell you what I get now is I get emails from all over the world just constantly. People are so interested in this field. And it's really not limited to the U.S. at all. In fact, in some countries, you'd be surprised, Pakistan and China, I hear from so many students and professors. So it really has become international.
That's awesome. Well, that's a perfect segue for those who are just waiting to hear how many countries are on the line. 41 countries are represented on our call today. 41 countries. It's pretty cool, Ed.
Great.
So, yeah. So then the other question, Ed, is people talk about happiness in a broad term and in a broad sense. And for years, you've talked about subjective well-being. And I wondered if you might go back in time as to when that became the focus for you, and in a term that many of us associate with your inventing or your pulling together in the beginning. Could you talk about that?
Right. So, well, the problem with happiness is it sounded kind of flaky. And when I got into it, I ran into a lot of opposition. Oh my gosh, economists were attacking me. Even psychologists were attacking me. You don't know what happiness is and all this. It's a popular word. It means different things in different contexts. Sometimes it means good mood. Sometimes it means life satisfaction and so forth. So we thought we needed a different word. And a lot of people who are sort of the more rigorous scientists hated the word happiness. So that was part of the underlying thing of coming up with subjective well-being, well-being from your own viewpoint, what you think, how you evaluate your life. And you know, I still use the word happy a lot because in public it just resonates. Subjective well-being sounds kind of dry, but in a lot of our writing we try to use more specific terms.
Yeah, no, that's great. Now, I'm going to ask you, you don't have to answer it, but isn't it cool that you actually invented a term inside psychology?
Well, you know, I never know anymore if I invented it or not. I think maybe I did, but maybe it was around already. You know, it was a long
Yeah.
time ago, David,
Yeah.
and so maybe somebody else, you know, came up with it back then.
Well, if so, you surely brought it to life, that's for sure. So I think it's your humility that's saying that. But anyway, there's one personal question I have to ask you just for fun, and then I'm going to turn it to you. We'll go ahead and switch over the slides to you so that you can share the latest research, which I'm as eager as anyone else to hear. In my coaching practice, Ed, I always talk to folks about the importance of finding joy every day.
Yes.
And, you know, we talk about that in positive psychology. But I've heard a number of times from Carol, your wife, that when you are tired and you need a break and you want to relax and do something that's, I would say, joyful, you often say, honey, I'm going upstairs and I'm going to analyze some research data. Is that true?
You know, you shouldn't tell that story. You should tell a story about how good I am with my grandkids and so forth. Yeah, it is true. Sometimes positive psychologists are disappointed to hear that. They rather hear something about my social life or helping others and so forth. But I just love analyzing data and discovering new things. So I do really enjoy that. It's true.
That's awesome. Well, just as they say, use your natural strengths in your work, and that's clearly what you're doing, which I think that story just encapsulates that spirit. Well, Ed, let's move over to your presentation and sharing the latest and what's going on with subjective well-being and the impact it's having worldwide. Your slides, are you up now, up and running?
I'm up and running, and can you see that I just switched slides? Is that on your screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so the three things I want to mention today and talk about a little bit. The first one is the strong evidence that high subjective well-being is beneficial. You know, when we got into this, we wanted to study happiness because we thought, well, it's a good thing. People want it. It makes you feel good. It's kind of an enjoyment of life. You can't go wrong. But we didn't know was that characteristic, high subjective well-being, actually not only is related to a lot of positive characteristics, but in some sense causes them or makes them more likely in your life. So we're going to talk about that today. I think it's huge. I think it's hugely important. The second one, talk a little bit about where we are in the National Accounts of Wellbeing, the progress we've made and so forth since that 2000 article. And then the third one I just want to mention as a future research thing. So we say subjective well-being is very good for you, and people have been objecting, well, you know, sometimes being sad is important, sometimes some negative emotions or dissatisfaction can help motivate you. So I want to mention the evidence that would support that and just say when we say we want you to have high subjective well-being, it doesn't mean that you never feel sad or anything negative and that you're completely satisfied with everything. And that's really a new research direction in the field. So let's begin with the benefits of high subjective well-being. We've done literature reviews in each of these areas, and I'm just convinced the evidence is so strong that happy people are healthier. And it's not just that you're happy because you're healthy and you're not sick. No, happiness actually leads to health, as we'll talk about. Better social relationships if you're high in positive affect. Better work performance, better citizenship, and more creativity. So let's talk about each one of those in turn. First of all, the health outcomes, and Michaela Chan and I reviewed this in a 2011 article, that happy people live longer. It is found in most studies. There's a couple studies that don't find it, maybe even a study that goes in the opposite direction, but the overwhelming number of studies show that happy people live longer than unhappy people. And we'll talk about that a little more. They have stronger immune systems, T cells, and so forth. Because of that, they get fewer infections. If you go and infect them with the germ in a medical setting purposefully, they're more likely to resist the infection. They have better cardiovascular health, fewer strokes, less heart disease, and that's probably in part because there's less inflammation. And then, of course, the new area that's just exploding is the telomere shortening, the idea that the end caps of our DNA are worn away by stress, and perhaps now, even amazingly, built back up by positive sort of moods and so forth. And so this is a new area, and it's exciting because it means that the stress is going to make you age more, because you need those end caps there to protect your DNA. And when those end caps are gone, your DNA starts replicating less well, and this is related to aging. So that's big. The cancer evidence is very mixed, and so I won't talk about that today. Some of it's positive. You get over cancer quicker. Some of it finds nothing. So that part isn't for certain. And then health behaviors, the evidence is very strong that happier people tend to do healthy behaviors more frequently. So the health behaviors we're talking about are things like exercise, not smoking. People who are depressed are more likely to smoke, more likely to abuse alcohol. People who are happy are more likely to exercise, get their exercise weekly, use seat belts, and so forth. So these are some of the reasons that happy people live longer, because they do these health behaviors. Now, I think many of you already know the nun study, where Danner et al. Showed that the nuns lived about 10 years longer if they were cheerful at age 21 than if they were in the least cheerful group at age 21. So it wasn't health causing their happiness, because they get the happiness score way back at age 21, and they start following the nuns at age 75. So pretty clear. And the nice thing there is that the nuns are all living in the same circumstances, the same kind of housing, the same kind of diet and so forth, and you get this huge difference. Probably a less well-known study is this one I have here on famous psychologist. Sarah Pressman did this as her dissertation, and she looked at the autobiographies of famous psychologists, people like Freud, who you see here in the lower left, and she found that the ones who expressed positive emotions in their autobiographies lived about 5 years longer, and people who mentioned something about their social relationships lived about 5 years longer. Some of them only talked about their work and never mentioned their family, but ones who mentioned their family and friends lived 5 years longer. And then she went, and she had done this on about over 70 psychologists, famous ones. She found my biography, and she said, I ran it through the computer program, Ed, and guess what? You're the happiest of all the 70 psychologists I've studied.
Wow.
I said, well, that's wonderful, Sarah, but you know, I had read your study before I wrote my autobiography, so that might have made me kind of biased. Anyway, there's lots of studies like this, but there's also big studies. They're not all these kind of small and cute and interesting studies, big epidemiological type studies. Here's one of them done by Andrew Steptoe and Wardle, and they start following people who are 50 or older. They follow them for 5 years. This is the months down on the x-axis on the bottom. And what you see is the high positive affect group, some of them die during this 60-month, 5-year period, but many more of the medium and way more of the blue group. And you see immediately the three groups, high positive, low positive, and medium positive, start diverging in terms of how long they live. And so we see all kinds of these very large-scale studies that really point in this same direction, that happiness is going to make you live longer and on average be a little bit healthier. Here's all the review articles. I just put them in here so people will have access to these. These are all review articles of this area, health being caused by happiness. Now, another one that we find is that life satisfaction, positive moods lead to better social relationships on the average. And let me just say, for all of these things, of course, there's exceptions. I mean, just as there's smokers who live to be 100 years old, it's unlikely, but it happens. There are happy people, of course, who die young, and there's unhappy people who live long. But all of these are, on the average, pretty strong trends. What we found, Micah Luhman was the main author of this study, was that if you follow people from when they're young, they haven't met their spouse yet, they haven't met their partner, they're 21 years old, and we follow them over time, that those who at time one have high life satisfaction are more likely to get married, they're more likely to stay married and not get divorced, and they're more likely to not be fired from their job, to stay employed. And so when you find out that married people are happier, yes, it could be the marriage making them happier, but it's also possible that they were happy before any of this ever began. That is, the happier people were selected into marriage. And this study we replicated in 3 different countries. So kind of pretty reliable results. You know, we have now a replication question in psychology. A lot of findings aren't replicating, but I'm proud to say this one replicated very well. Another study that we didn't do, but on life satisfaction in kids, they had a life satisfaction scale for children, 571 kids. They found out that the low life satisfaction kids in the future were more likely to be victimized at school, less likely to do pro-social behaviors. So we're finding this over and over, that happier people tend on average to have better social relationships. Another one that I've just completed, we had kids at 14, they're now about 10 years later, they're about age 25. We found that their positive affect, and not so much their negative affect, surprisingly, but their positive affect at time one at age 14 predicted how good their social relationships were later. More pro-social behavior, less anti-social behavior, etc. So lots of evidence in this realm showing that high subjective well-being is good for relationships. Also at work. So we found in one of our early studies around 2000 that individuals who are happy going into college later earn higher incomes. And this is controlling for their major and their parental income and all kinds of things. And other people have replicated that finding as well, that happier young people on average do tend to make more money later. Also, happier companies where people are satisfied, the working conditions are better, their stock prices seem to go up more. And so there's some studies on that now. So we're saying happiness in the workplace is not just a good thing because we want our workers to be happy, but for the greedy guy who just wants to make more money, let's say, owning a factory, it's going to be good for him too, or her too, because it actually is going to produce probably a little bit better performing workers. Here are all the different paths that we find. Subjective well-being there is on the far left, and over on the right in the red square is organizational performance, productivity, profitability, and so forth. And we find that each of the things in the middle is affected, at least in some cases, by high subjective well-being, job satisfaction, positive affect on the job, and so forth. So lower health care costs, less turnover. It's not surprising if workers like working there and they enjoy their job, they're less likely to quit. And turnover, of course, is very expensive for businesses. They take fewer sick days, greater customer satisfaction. Again, not surprising, right? That if you go to a store or you go to a restaurant where the people waiting on you are very positive and happy with their job, you're going to like it more than where they're grumpy and they don't want to be waiting on you. So you get higher customer satisfaction, you get more organizational citizenship, meaning happier workers, and this is a very strong relationship, are more likely to help other workers, less likely to steal from the job, and more likely to talk up the company and so forth. You get a lot of evidence on creativity coming out of positive affect, self-regulation. Happy workers, of course, have more energy, and happy workers have greater social skills. So because of all of those things, that company is more likely to be productive and profitable. Okay, now the next one I want to mention, the last one, is citizenship. So I mentioned that happy people are better organizational citizens at work, more likely to do volunteer, more likely to help other workers, etc. We find in our research, happy people are more likely to do volunteer work and more likely to donate money to charity. So all the way around here, we have a pretty positive view of the benefits of high subjective well-being. So people say to me sometimes, Diener, have you learned anything? All this stuff you're finding out seems so common sense. Like, sure, some people are born happier. There's a genetic component. That seems obvious. And sure, being above the poverty line is going to help your life satisfaction. Have you found out anything that's not just obvious? And I'd say this is it. That happiness does not just feel good, but it's beneficial. I don't think people knew that. I certainly didn't know that. We thought it was good because it was enjoyable and we wanted people to be happy, but we did not realize the profound consequence that happiness itself helps you live a better life. And I've gone so far now to say is happiness or high subjective well-being, things like life satisfaction and positive affect, are actually a virtue. So, there's been a lot of talk about the difference between hedonics, which sounds like pleasure, like eating and drinking and having sex, but really high subjective well-being is much broader than that. It encompasses people's values. It encompasses people getting their goals that they think are valuable and important in life. And so it turns out that in one way, high subjective well-being is itself eudaimonic in Aristotle's sense that high subjective well-being is truly a virtue. And I think this has huge import in our field, and that people need to know this and learn this. Some people say, oh, I don't want to be happy, I like being grumpy and all those things. This is important for we as positive psychologists to know and get out there in the world. Okay, so the second thing I wanted to talk about, David, is the National Accounts of Wellbeing, which you mentioned. And as you mentioned, in 2000, that year we came out in American Psychologist, Marty and Csikszentmihalyi and all the rest of us came out with articles. My article was about National Accounts of Wellbeing, and I was proposing that we track well-being in countries, and of course also in smaller units like counties and cities and neighborhoods, for input to policy, not just to say, oh, Denmark's happier than a country in Africa, but to look to see if it can tell us things about what policies that leaders or politicians can enact that are going to improve things. So we're talking about tracking psychological well-being. It would include subjective well-being. We could also have in there things like meaning and purpose, which is big in a lot of positive psychology areas, relationship quality, mastery, and so forth. And we look at people living in different circumstances, different neighborhoods, and we see from that what it is that's affecting these types of psychological well-being, and from that, what kinds of policies or geographical differences and so forth influence subjective well-being and psychological well-being. So why would we want to do this? Well, there's really three reasons. The first one I've already told you. We want to track it just like why do we want to track education? Why do we want to track crime? Why do we want to track the economy? Because we think crime's bad and we want those tracking of crime to help us get a grip on it and control it and keep it down. Why do we track education and the economy? Because we tend to think those are good and we want policies to increase those. So if we want psychological well-being, we need to be tracking that. And if we do, of course, it can increase people's, as I say, virtue. Another reason is the democratic reason, number two. That is, people value happiness. We found college students around the world, one of their highest, if not the highest value was on happiness. So yes, they think love is very important. Health is pretty darn important. Money, a little bit important, not so important for college students. But happiness was at the top of the list in terms of how important it is. So we think that tracking happiness it makes sense just because you want to give citizens of a country the things they think are important. That's the mandate of democratic governments. And then thirdly, we wanted to, and this was our original motivation, because happiness or high subjective well-being can reflect the quality of life in societies. It tells us more, as Marty and I wrote in the 2000 Beyond Money article, 2005, I mean Beyond Money article, it's not just GDP. GDP has helped countries develop economically and so forth. We don't want to knock that too much, but what we want to say is there's so much more to quality of life than that, and subjective well-being is going to pick that up. If you have corruption, it's going to lower it. If you have bad social relationship distrust, it's going to lower it, separately from how the economy is doing. So these three reasons make a pretty strong case for why we think we need national accounts of well-being. Now here is a little history. So I used to give talks before I wrote the 2000 article. If you look there at the top, it says 1990, economists hate Ed Diener. I would talk about this idea way back then, just getting started, and the economists just thought it was crazy. They would just shout me down. I mean, you couldn't even get through your talk because they say, you can't measure it, and we've got money, and we don't need that, and it's really baloney and so forth. Then I wrote the article in 2000. Then, surprisingly, in 2003, I was invited to give a talk at the World Bank about this. Again, the economists were skeptical, but the fact that I had been invited there was something. Then we had the meetings every summer in Philadelphia at the Positive Psych Center on Market Street, 2005 to 2007, in which we brought in leaders. We brought in policymakers, economists, anthropologists, philosophers, and we all talked for weeks on end about national accounts of well-being, how they would work, what they would be, and so forth. This really started to spur things on. A big jump came in 2008. I was invited to talk to the UN Development Program in New York City at the UN, and I talked about it, and they were skeptical too, a lot of economists there, but they put national well-being numbers in their 2010 decennial, every 10-year report on how the world's doing. So this was really kind of a breakthrough. 2009, I wrote an article with economists and psychologists on the idea. It's that blue book there you see. It's a pretty boring book, but if you have sleep problems, read this book because it'll put you to sleep for sure. But what it did was it marched through the arguments and all the arguments against it and sort of showed why they didn't make sense. And so it was a very thoroughgoing book arguing for the national accounts. Then in 2010, something amazing, something big that many of you know about happened. David Cameron announced that the United Kingdom was going to start tracking subjective well-being, including meaning and purpose, life satisfaction, positive and negative affect, low negative affect, of course, and they were going to do that and use it in policy. And it actually has probably influenced a couple of policies now in the United Kingdom. 2013, 14, more big things happened. Felicia Huppert ran a European Union module in which they measured well-being, subjective well-being in all the European Union countries. And by 2014, 41 nations have adopted some kind of measure of well-being. It may not always be the complete national accounts of well-being, of course, but they've measured it in some way. And then finally, I'll mention the last two things. National Academy of Sciences appointed a committee to look at this idea in 2000, and I was on there. Danny Kahneman, the economist, psychologist, was on there. And this was written by an economist, the report, and it was very positive in terms of the idea of national accounts of well-being. There were caveats and warnings in there. We have to worry about this or that, but mostly it was positive. And then even more positive, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, wrote guidelines for measuring subjective well-being and published those in 2013. This is a big thing because the OECD coordinates the statistical offices of the 34 richest countries in the world. And so they publishing this, it sort of gives the go-ahead to statistical offices to start doing this, or at least it prompts them in that direction. And if you want to read any more about it, where we are now, 2015, this year, I and some colleagues wrote another review in American Psychologist on where the national accounts stand. So we've made quite a bit of progress, David, and let me just show you a few of the things very quickly that do predict the well-being of nations. Of course, they're rich countries tend to have higher life satisfaction than poor countries. Shige Oishi and I found that progressive income tax, where the rich pay a higher percentage, is related to well-being of countries. Human rights are protected. My wife and daughter and I published an article on that. Inequality, as you know, is growing throughout the world. That's bad because we show that, at least in some cases, inequality lowers life satisfaction. We've also shown that income redistribution efforts, where you have programs to help poor people, can buffer income inequality so that it doesn't have such a negative impact. Corruption lowers happiness of countries. Unemployment, very severe. People who are fired or laid off from their jobs, their life satisfaction drops and doesn't come back completely for a long time. And high unemployment areas are less happy areas. Some more things we know: clean air predicts happier societies, green space, having more trees and plants around, active commuting, that is, if you switch from taking the subway or driving to work and you start biking to work or walking to work, life satisfaction tends to go up. Job training programs are related to higher well-being, income security, and so forth. Caregiver programs, for example, for people taking care of Alzheimer's. So we know a lot of the things that help well-being, and each one of these findings then can tell us about policy things that could lead to a better society. So what I want to say to the group is that you could start thinking about using the subjective well-being findings to leverage what it is that you are pushing in terms of psychological well-being, positive psychology. Some people say, oh, we want to push, educating kids about social skills. They have all kinds of things that they think are good. And this national accounts of well-being or measures of well-being is one thing that can help you convince people that your program is a good one. So using it as a leverage, not like, oh, well, that's Diener's thing and he's doing it and I'm doing something else. No, hopefully what I'm doing here is useful to you. Okay, then the third one we'll cover real quickly so we have plenty of time for questions and comments and discussion, is the recent question: can people be too happy? Do we need to be unhappy a little bit? And if we're going to have interventions, how happy do people need? How happy do we want our societies to be? And these are very much open research questions. So there's a little bit of evidence to suggest that you don't want necessarily to be manic-y all the time, euphoric all the time, and so forth. So we found, for example, that people who are highest in life satisfaction, who are 10s on a 10-point scale, they're very social, but the people who achieve the most, get the highest grades, earn the highest income, are 8s or 9s. So pretty high. It's not the 1s or 2s. We're not talking about people who are dissatisfied with their life or depressed. They don't do well at all. But some evidence that maybe a little bit less than 100% satisfaction might be a good thing. Much more research is needed on this, but we think it's interesting. PA and creativity. So some studies showing, many studies showing that positive affect increases creativity, both in the workplace and the laboratory experiments, but sometimes a little bit of negative affect thrown in enhances the creativity even more. You don't want lots of negative affect, that'll kill it. You don't want lots of negative affect and no positive, that's the worst. But what you want is quite a bit of positive affect with maybe a little bit. Once again, new area, new findings, so it's still in the research stages, but interesting. And then we know that perhaps very aroused kinds of manicky positive affect may not be good for your health. So all I'm saying here is, David and others, that we know that positive affect's a good thing, but that doesn't mean people have to be happy every second. They should be sad at their mother's funeral and so forth. And, you know, a little bit of worry occasionally can spur us on and so forth. So when we talk about high subjective well-being, we don't mean get rid of all negative feelings whatsoever from your life. Although if you feel chronically negative affect, then that's going to be bad for you. So June Gruber has been doing a lot of this research. She says, these S's that you can have, she has 7 of them actually, but you can have too much positive affect that is too high of arousal for the situation you're in. You don't want positive affect in some situations. I mean, if you're facing a tragedy, you're at your mother's funeral, you know, it probably makes sense to be somewhat sad, right, in that situation. She says not all positive affect is good. You could have pride or hubris in the wrong situations. You could be gloating over somebody's misfortune, etc. So, of course, gratitude and compassion and certain kinds of positive affect may have better outcomes than others. Self-regulation, if you can't control your negative affect, sometimes we need to lower our negative affect so we can really get into a task and not be distracted. People who aren't able to do that may suffer. And then finally, we know that if you strive for positive affect in the wrong way, especially in hedonistic ways, it may not be effective. It may make you less happy. So does going after happiness make you happy or unhappy? This age-old debate, and it may depend a lot on how you go about striving for happiness. That if you strive for happiness by meeting challenges and by helping other people, it might just work. And if you strive for it by a lot of sex and drugs, it might just not work. Okay, and then I show you our son's book, Robert and Todd Kazdan, Robert PPLSDiener, and they talk about a lot of this research here where negative affect can occasionally be helpful. And so it's sort of the counterpoint to much of my research showing the real value of positive affect. So let me summarize, then we'll have questions and comments. So high subjective well-being has beneficial outcomes. The evidence, I would say, is not 100%, but boy, it's up there at 80 or 90%. I've become convinced, and I was not a true believer at the beginning. I was skeptical, and I think the evidence is very strong. But we do need negative affect occasionally. Sometimes it may even help us. And then finally, national accounts of well-being are on the horizon. Now the question is, will politicians use them? There's a couple instances around mental health where it looks like they have been influenced by these findings, these national accounts. But we don't know. The politicians may be skeptical. They may say, we don't want anything to do with that. So that's the next big challenge. And then for each of you listeners, can you find results with subjective well-being that would show that your intervention, the thing that you care about in positive psychology, actually enhances subjective well-being? So I think that's a big challenge for all of us now in the future. And thank you very much. David, we'll go to questions and discussion.
Yeah, Ed, you packed it in. You've done this before for us a couple times, and the amount of information you're able to get in is phenomenal.
Sorry to talk so quickly. Sorry
no,
to
you speak
so
clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, really. I've seen you present for at least 15 years now, showing our age, starting back in Washington, D.C. at the old Positive Psychology Summits before. Yeah, and when you were emceeing and leading those conferences. So
right. Right.
You continue to do great. And I have to tell you, the same feeling that I had when I sat in the master's class at the University of Pennsylvania 10 years ago, and you were presenting, and I just said, wow, I'm home. This is the place I want to be. You know, this is such an exciting field to be in. I have that same feeling now, and people are making the same comments are coming in, Ed, where people just feel as though their purpose in helping make the world a better place, or their families a better place, or their workplace better, is what you've just shown demonstrates again the importance of what we're all trying to do in positive psychology.
Wonderful.
So if nothing else, thank you very much for the inspiration for everybody.
Great, thank you.
So you're welcome. You're welcome. A number of questions. So if you remember our first map class, hands go flying up. Well, that's what's happening right now. We have a lot of people with questions. So if you're ready, I'll pepper them with you.
I'm ready.
All right. First one comes from Roger Dillow, and he just wanted to ask if you could comment on the research methodology in operationally defining and measuring subjective well-being, and how reliable is self-report in making the measures?
Yes. So we use a lot of self-report. When you do something like the Gallup World Poll, we have almost 2 million people now. It's going to be self-report. You can't use the other measures. But we've done a fair amount of work with other types of measures to validate the self-report measure. For example, we get informant reports from your family and friends, and they converge to some degree with your self-reports. We get memory and reaction time kind of data where you can remember lots of good things that happened to you this week versus lots of bad things, and we find that that corroborates self-reports. We use some physiological measures. You can look at immune function, fibrinogen in the blood, you can look at cortisol, etc. So the self-report measures show a fair amount of validity. If you could only use one measure, you probably ought to use that. It's probably going to be better than the physiological by themselves, at least right now, or the informant reports. But we also know there's some biases, and these biases occasionally creep in and can be a problem, and we've studied those a lot. Americans, for example, are a little more positive in general, regardless of their happiness level, than, say, Japanese. So there's a positivity bias that you need to take into account when you compare countries. We also know that some people will try to act happier than they are. A whole variety of biases. Most of them we think we can mostly control. Sometimes you say, well, there's item order effects. So if you ask about the federal government and the national government, then you ask people about their life satisfaction is lower than if you hadn't mentioned that national thing first. But it's easy to control because all you have to do is say, every time we do the survey, we're going to put the life satisfaction question first. We're not going to change the order of things. So many of these biases we either know how to control or know how to assess. If I had to give the measures a grade from A to F, I might give them a B, B minus, probably about as good to me as many economic measures, surprisingly, which also have their faults, but certainly not as good as measures in physics. But I think we're doing a pretty good job, and the fact that so many interesting, reliable, and valid findings come out of these measures also shows. If you want to look at a validity, go to my personal website and go to, I think it's a 2013, Diener, Engelhardt, and Tay. It's a review of the validity of life satisfaction measures, and it's a pretty thorough review of that area.
That's great, Ed. The questions keep flying in. One of the questions comes in around the correlation between subjective well-being and enduring confidence. There's one question that was Mark Liston. Connected to that was a question from Tobias Ram, and his was, what is the correlation between subjective well-being and what Marty Seligman talks about, PERMA? If you could comment any of those.
Yeah, so let me talk about PERMA. So subjective well-being, Marty puts in the P, pleasure. But I argue that actually subjective well-being is much more than that. Life satisfaction is much broader, certainly, than physical pleasure. Life satisfaction means you judge your life well. That means that you're achieving the things that you want, your relationships are good. So it's much broader than some kind of hedonistic thing. And if you look at the other aspects of PERMA, things like relationships and mastery and engagement, they all can heighten subjective well-being. So I think that's the way it goes. I mean, even your emotions are not just hedonistic. Your emotions reflect you accomplishing the things that you think important, that good things are happening that you value in your life. And then I must say a reference to the second question. I don't know the answer. It may vary cross-culturally in terms of confidence in subjective well-being. I would say it's definitely a positive relationship in the U.S. for sure. But we found that some of these things vary across countries, like these correlates. And so, for example, we found self-esteem is a strong predictor of life satisfaction in the U.S., but much less so self-esteem predicts satisfaction in, say, collectivist countries.
Okay, that makes sense. I got a follow-up big question, Ed. So you're going to predict the future. Your colleague, Marty Seligman, again, has talked about PERMA, and that hopefully in the year 2051, that more than 51% of the world will be flourishing. And the question from Andy Proctor is, do you think that is possible?
I think it's definitely possible. There's a lot I know that the news focuses on the bad things, but, people have written books lately about all the good things that are happening, and I believe, sure, climate change is a worrisome thing, but actually many aspects of the environment have improved. So if you only focus on the bad things, you get a warped view. So many things in the world are going well. We focus on the Middle East. We say, oh, Africa is so poor. Well, I'll tell you what, the economies in Africa are improving. Some of the African countries, you see it around the world, are becoming more democratic. You see this sort of increasing. So I'm very positive and optimistic at the big level, but I think at the small individual level, we're moving in that direction too. I mean, just look at how many people are interested in positive psychology in China and Australia and all over the world, and the way that the movement is catching on. So I think it is possible. I think we're going to get there.
That's awesome. Let's, as they say, trumpet that from the hilltops. Ed Diener has said it. Another question comes from Angela Mountain, and she says, do you think that higher levels of happiness, she's done some studies and found that people report work as being one of the more important factors in their happiness. And she asked the question, do you think that higher levels of happiness would be linked to the helping professions?
That question I don't know the answer to. I'm an empiricist, so I could make it up and say sure, but I don't know that. I don't know that. I don't know any data. I do think that most people actually are happy at work, surprisingly. I have a sample of about 900 women in Texas that I got from Danny Kahneman, and those women are a little bit happier at home socializing than they are at work. But 95, we said, let's look at the ones who are unhappy at work. And my graduate student said, we can't do it. There's just too few. There are some who are tremendously unhappy at work, but it's not very many people. These women are mostly in a positive attitude at work. Now, there's things that predict that, having flexible work hours, having work they enjoy. The interesting thing is you might think that they enjoy socializing at work. That's not a predictor. Enjoying the work itself, accomplishing things, mastery, Marty's kind of permith sort of things predict happiness at work.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. There's a question just coming in from Pakistan, and the question being that the measures of, and that is Naumana Amjad, and she had said that that her society is at the lower end of happiness by some of these indicators and high on some, and she just asked, how do I help as a positive psychologist? How do I help, lift those levers of subjective well-being?
Well, of course, Yes, it's a big question, and it depends on where you are in positive psychology because, we have people who work for the Center for Disease Control. Their approach is going to be far different, right? Then we have clinicians and coaches. What they can do about it is going to be different. The interesting thing, though, about Pakistan, of course, in some of these countries, we do find fair amount of anger and negative emotions. But on the other hand, there is a lot of interest in Pakistan. I get probably more emails from people in Pakistan wanting to use my scales, wanting to get my articles, than almost any other country in the world, maybe China. But it's amazing. So there's real interest there, and so I think that there might be a tipping point where you start pushing the society in that direction.
That's awesome. On that note, one of the questions was, would you recommend a particular subjective well-being scale that many of us in the practitioner field should use to work with clients?
Well, it depends what you want to measure. On our website, we have about 5 scales. On my website, 5 scales. They're all free. They're all open to use for anybody. We have the life satisfaction scale. It's kind of a well-known scale, been used for many years, cited 12,000 times in the literature. But we also have an 8-item flourishing scale. We have a 12-item affect, positive and negative affect scale. It's called the Spain. And then we have comprehensive inventory of thriving, CIT. That scale has many items to measure each of the various PERMA factors. So it has mastery, it has various facets of relationships and so forth. So we have scales there that you can use, and of course there's many other scales around for measuring self-esteem and so forth. So somebody ought to put a book together sometime, positive psychology scales, but we do have a number of them that you're welcome to use.
Well, Ed, you're only the professor of 2 universities, a senior scientist at the Gallup organization, and author of papers. Why don't you do that? One more book to write.
Yes.
What we need to get you involved in is the cloning business so that there's more of you for all of us.
Oh, thank you, David.
Yeah, I'm sure Carol would agree, right?
She might, although I would like to clone her.
Yeah, that's even better. Good answer. Good answer. I wanted also just to acknowledge Cynthia Spradlin was the one who asked about the scales. And
oh, thank you.
Yeah, which is great. Lots of more questions coming in. One of the questions, Ed, that I wanted to ask you is just, could you tell us a little bit more about how one country's subjective well-being increase over time or a region's increase over time might influence other countries or other regions? How much work is being done in that area?
Very little. I'll tell you something that I notice related to that is there is a little bit of neighboring country effect that if you look at the map, there's a little bit of spillover. Let's say Canada is a little bit happier than U.S. You see a little spillover. U.S. a little bit happier than Mexico. Mexico is pretty happy for its level of economic development. So you do see some, just as we know that in social networks, happiness spreads to some degree, right? If you're around a happy person, other people around them become a little happier, and if you're around a grouchy, negative person, everybody becomes a little less happy, the bad apple phenomenon. And we know that that is probably, not strong with countries, but that it looks at least like it occurs across countries. But as far as I know, nobody's published on this and so forth. I do think that when you see successes around in education or so forth of positive side, those can spread quickly. If they get out there in the media and people learn about them, more and more people wondering how we can introduce it into the schools, into education. So I do think there's a spreading, modeling effect here.
Oh, that's great. Ed, we'll squeeze in one more question. We had recently, Kelly McGonigal presented recently to our group, and she talked about the upside of stress. And it's not so much that stress itself is bad, it's how you look at stress that the research demonstrates. Any comment about, because most people report some form of stress in their life, and as people get older and challenges in work and so forth, any comments on subjective well-being and stress and
Sure.
how
So,
looking at it differently?
so I think what we know is that there is such a thing that she was talking about called eustress, where you're challenged. It's a little bit much, but you're challenged by it, and it really energizes you, and in the long run ends up being rewarding. Then there's what's called sort of middle class stress. I'm stressed out, I have too much to do, and it's slightly negative, but it's not that bad. And then we have what I would call real stress. Your child is dying from cancer. This kind of stress is the one that really can not pull people's moods alone down, but also can pull down their health and so forth. So like subjective well-being, it's got different elements, and I think you're right to recognize that not every form of stress is a bad thing, and we've known this for quite a while, but there are some forms of stress that are quite harmful.
Yeah, we'll conclude here with, but just saying that one of the things that I think is very liberating about your work is that you've concluded in your son, Robert PPLSDiener, as you mentioned, and Todd Cashton and others, said that being happy is a great thing, but it doesn't disqualify you from feeling natural emotions that occur when things happen that would make you sad. But that what's also very uplifting about your message is that you don't want that to turn to chronic sadness or anger, and so it doesn't have to dominate your life. So learning how to live a happy life and at the same time naturally respond to disappointments and frustrations and
Exactly.
upsets in life, right, is normal, is natural.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great. And we have the science to demonstrate that, which is really, really very exciting. Ed, if you remember that first class at the University of Pennsylvania that you came as our guest lecturer that first weekend, everybody's hand was still up when you finished. That's how it is right now. We still have a lot of people wanting to ask questions, and unfortunately we don't have time for every one of them. We are going to put up, I'll tell this to everyone, and then Ed, if there's any place you would like to direct people, just think about that for a moment. We are going to put up for all of you the research references that Dr. Diener made today on the website next week. We'll have links to all of his sites, places that he referenced, so that you'll have one place to go for all of that. Ed, any final direction where you'd like to point people to?
Well, let me just say that website of mine not only has all those scales on it, but also has all of my articles on it. So if anybody's interested in any of these, you go, you click on them, and they come to you immediately by email.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm going to conclude with saying first, three things we're going to do here. The first is just say, Ed, thanks for making the time. We know how busy you are. Really, thank you for coming today.
You're welcome. It was fun to be here.
Yeah, it's always fun to be with you. You are one of my heroes. I don't say that lightly in positive psychology. So you live what you research.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So we want to thank, of course, Ed. We want to thank also our executive director, James Pawelski, for his support of this program. James sends his best. He's away today. President Barbara Fredrickson, grateful for her support of this program. Our producer of the series, a lot of hard work goes on behind the scenes by Jenny Brennan. So give it up to her anytime you get a chance to say hello to her. She does a great job. And our technical and social media director, Sydney Rubin, also a ton of work behind the scenes, and they live positive psychology. I'm so blessed to work with them. So I want to thank all of you again for joining us. 41 countries represented today. Absolutely awesome. I'm David J. Paulet. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for making a difference through your work in positive psychology. Goodbye, and we'll catch you next month for another edition of the Positive Psychology Leader Series. Bye-bye.